Some of the hardest problems in the world exist far above the planet. Our job? To launch the smartest solutions, to protect our satellites, clean up our clutter, to propel breakthroughs in propulsion, to learn more about our place in the universe, to outpace emerging threats. Every day, the Aerospace Corporation uses the latest technologies to ensure our nation's safety and leadership in space.
Hi, and welcome to the Space Policy Show. We are experiencing technical difficulties again with Vimeo, so we decided to go ahead and record, and we will have this up probably in about an hour. So today we have Karen Jones and Lina Cashin to talk about closing the Arctic infrastructure gap, national security and commercial considerations. So we're very lucky to have them here with us. A little bit about Karen. She is a senior policy analyst with the Center for Space Policy and Strategy. Prior to joining aerospace, Ms. Jones worked as an exploration geologist and later as a management consultant with Arthur D. Little and IBM Global Services. She is an MBA from Yale School of Management. We also have Colonel Lina Cashin joining us today. She retired from the Air Force after 24 distinguished years of service, focusing on policy and strategy for the U.S. Strategic Command. She's now working as a lead technical advisor for the Space Command in Omaha, Nebraska. So thank you both for being with us today. And a little bit about our technical issues. So we are aware that, from time to time, the Vimeo platform does not work and that we are experiencing an unprecedented amount of people using the internet and streaming overall. So with that in mind, in the future, if for whatever reason, the link doesn't work or we're not able to go live, we will be recording these episodes and posting them on our website. You can visit aerospace.org/policy, click watch previous episodes, and you will see the latest episode pinned at the top. But thank you so much for your patience. We really appreciate it. And please feel free to interact with the videos, post comments, questions, things like that. We will do our best to try and, engage and interact with you as much as we can. And with that said, I'd like to go ahead and kick it over to Karen. Thank you so much, Karen, for being here today.
Thank you, Rebecca, and welcome everyone to the Space Policy Show. This is the 7th show in the series, and today we'll be talking about the Arctic, space-based solutions and national security imperatives. We selected this topic because the changes in the Arctic are accelerating at a time when the U.S. needs to advance security interests, pursue responsible stewardship, and work closely with our allies to protect the Arctic environment. So our agenda, next slide please, will be to start from a historical perspective and discuss brief history, the role of the Arctic Council, the story of the three bears, the three big competitors in the region. And Lina will then highlight some emerging Arctic policy issues and the implications for national defense strategy as well as national security. I do want to add that the Center for Space Policy and Strategy recently developed a paper, and it's also on our website, called Closing the Arctic Infrastructure Gap, Existing and Emerging Space-Based Solutions. So feel free to take a look at that as well. Next slide, please. So the Arctic, the word itself, comes from Arctos, a Greek word meaning bear. The northern sky's Great Bear constellation is Ursa Major. And here is Ursa Minor, my pet polar bear right here. So we're going to start by just giving you a brief overview of the history. And I'd like to start by just saying the indigenous people of the region, the Inuits and others, have occupied this area for 4,000 years, perhaps longer. And then more recently, but still in the distant past, Arctic explorers came into the region. And the important thing to think about here is that when Eric the Red discovered and settled on Greenland, he did this during a time of warming. And you can start to see a pattern where there are some brief periods of warming in our history, perhaps nothing like we're experiencing now. But during that time, we also see an increase in maritime activity and travel. The Russian Arctic Empire is vast. Russia has 9 time zones in the Arctic region. And it started with in the 12th century when Russia began exploring Siberia. Later in the 17th century, Russia's empire became very vast. And in fact, Alaska really represents the point at which U.S. Western expansion hits Russian Eastern expansion. Northern Canada's region is also very vast. It covers northern Canada, and when I say that, it's basically Canada above, I think, 65 degrees. And it represents about 65% of the mass of Canada and only 1% of the population. And it covers over 36,000 islands. Now, Alaska was added to the Union in 1868, and Secretary of State Seward, when asked at his retirement, what do you consider your greatest achievement? He said, the purchase of Alaska is by far my greatest achievement, but it will take another generation before people realize that. And that is probably true. He was actually somewhat persecuted and the public was outraged when Alaska was purchased from Imperial Russia for $7.2 million. Later during the Clinton administration, a Russian nationalist by the name of Vladimir, I'm trying to remember his name, Zhirinovsky, announced that he thought Russia should take Alaska back. So someone from the Clinton administration went to National Archives and managed to find the receipt for the purchase of Alaska. So remember to always save your receipts. Alaska also had a very brief period of time, some people forget, during the Pacific War, where the Aleutian Islands were briefly occupied by the Japanese. Beyond some of the territory, it's also important to remember the 2 major sea routes in the Arctic area, the Northern Sea Route, which Russia controls, and the Northwest Passage, which Canada controls. Next slide, please. So here's a map of the Arctic, and the purple circle represents 65.5 degrees north. That is the Arctic Circle. This represents 1/6 of the planet in terms of land, not land mass, but just area. And it is enormous. It's vast, it's diverse, and it's dynamic. 4 million people live inside the Arctic Circle, half of which are Russian. We're seeing a lot of increased activity, both with the Northern Sea Route as well as the Northwest Passage. It's going to be a very interesting time for the Northern Sea Route. There has been a significant amount of activity. In fact, the volume of traffic over the last 3 years in the NSR has increased 7-fold. And the reason for that is you can lop off about 40% in distance instead of going around the Suez Canal. So it represents a rather short travel time between Asia and Northern Europe. Next slide, please.
Karen, before you move on, I did have a question for you about Svalbard. It's known as the world's largest satellite ground station. And as you pointed out, it's in a very strategic location. We've heard that there is controversy regarding who and how it should be used, basically over restrictions on how it should be used. What do you think about that?
Well, it is an important asset. In fact, if you go back to that slide really quickly, you'll see a yellow star that represents the archipelago of Svalbard. It is the northernmost outpost of the Kingdom of Norway, and it was granted to Norway. Norway has sovereignty over the archipelago and they were granted that after World War One, but under very, very specific conditions of the Svalbard Treaty. And one of those conditions is that this island, or this series of islands, cannot be used for warlike purposes. Also, the use of Svalbard must be applied in a non-discriminatory fashion so that signatories of the treaty have access to, coal, and they can basically extract and exploit some of the resources there. So it's rather unique. It is under Norway's sovereignty, but with some very specific conditions. It also represents the world's largest satellite ground station, and it's on a little bit of a mountain. So it's in a great sweet spot. You can almost see geos, or you can, but you can also see every polar orbit of the 14 or 15, roughly at around 800 to 900 kilometers. So it's a great spot, and it is a growing ground station in the region. But again, it cannot be used solely for military purposes. Next slide, please. So the Arctic region is governed by what's known as the Arctic Council. And this was established by the 1998 Ottawa Declaration. It includes the 5 littoral or coastal countries of US, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and Russia. It also includes 3 other countries without coastal Arctic coastal areas: Iceland, Sweden, and Finland. These are the permanent Arctic members of the Arctic Council. In addition to that, there are observer states, and there are several observer states. So it's a very vast region, and there's also some significant territorial disputes in the region itself. Arctic territorial claims are governed by the UN Convention Law of the Sea. And it depends upon, unfortunately, rather poorly mapped seabed geography. So if you look at, and you can see it here, it's a little bit blurry, but the Lomonosov Ridge, which bisects the Arctic Ocean. This comes out of the seafloor, and it's a very large mountain range, really, about 14,000 feet high. Now, the UN Convention Law of the Sea basically says, you own 12 miles outside your coastal area from low tide, and then 200 nautical miles out. And then it depends upon your actual continental shelf geography. So there are some advantages for the various countries in this area to try to prove that it's part of their continental shelf. So several years ago, Russia, and they went through the appropriate process of filing that they were going to conduct this geodetic survey, actually planted a rust-proof titanium flag on the floor, on the seafloor, on the Lomonosov Ridge. It is very strategic, and Greenland also believes it's part of their continental shelf. So it's an interesting time because there are some strong territorial disputes. But what we're seeing from a lot of these countries is that the benefit to cooperation greatly exceeds the costs for any dispute. I attended several months ago the Wilson Institute fabulous Arctic conference, and one quote from that was, "The disputes of the North Pole will not be fought by soldiers with weapons. Instead, it will be by scientists who prove supporting evidence." And the Lomonosov Ridge is one of those. Next slide, please. So one of the key operational challenges for north of the Arctic Circle is accurate PNT, or accurate navigation. It's very difficult sometimes in this region because there's quite a bit of ionospheric activity that fluctuates in intensity based upon the solar cycle. And every 11 years or so, ionospheric activity will get very active, and it creates, wonderful aurora borealis effects in the area, but it also causes a lot of problems for electronics, including GPS satellites. It causes something called signal scintillation, and it creates problems with the phase of the signals, which creates problems with geolocation in the area. There's also some challenges with elevation accuracy by virtue of the global navigation satellite systems themselves, which are not in high inclination orbit. The highest inclination orbit of the three GNSS satellites that we typically consider is GLONASS, the Russian version of GPS, which gets up to 65 degrees. GPS is closer to 55 degrees. And because of this, we don't always get the most accurate coordinates. But there are several different types of solutions that are under investigation, including hosted payloads, maybe on some GEOs and HEOs. There could also be some additional ground-based systems to help with triangulation. The Center for Space Policy and Strategy is developing a paper focused on future GNSS solutions for extreme latitudes. So hopefully we'll have that paper published later during 2020. And hopefully the US government will consider a wide range of incentives and mandates to encourage the extension of GNSS in the far north. Next slide, please. So at a time when traditional ways of life are at risk in the Arctic, high-speed broadband connection is going to be very, very important. It's a huge economic equalizer, and it's a transformative platform on several levels, including e-commerce, e-government, telemedicine, scientific research, trade and transportation, and public safety. So closing this digital divide will serve the Arctic region on several strategic fronts, including economic, social, environmental, and geopolitical. I think we're going to see some commercial solutions in the near future. Certainly, it's already started to happen. But there are challenges. There's a very low population density, not surprising in the region. This means that in general, the Arctic lacks what's called market clout. You just don't have the population density necessarily to draw service providers to the region. And if they do show up, will the services be affordable? Will it be enough of a competitive environment for Arctic citizens to be able to afford and participate? So I think in general, the Arctic Council, as well as other organizations, are looking for ways to encourage innovative solutions to increase connectivity and affordability. There are several incumbents currently that are in the region. Iridium, certainly, they just expanded their constellation. They have 66 operational satellites plus some spares, but they are not at what we call broadband speeds. And the FCC defines broadband speeds as 55 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload. Other operators in the area include O3B, but they really don't reach too much further than Alaska. HughesNet can cover parts of the Arctic, but there's a very high latency. So we are beginning to see, however, some commercial companies focus on this region, including some low Earth orbit mega constellations. Next slide, please. So a few more things about incumbents. Argos is a Russian store and forward system of 12 satellites. It's been around since 1978, and they will be launching a new constellation of 22 CubeSats by 2022. Similar to that is a French constellation known as GoNets. Similar market focus. It's going to focus on civilian and logistic applications and scientific applications. It's also small satellites, store and forward. The legend here shows that the red clocks represent slow speeds. The lightning bolts, the red clocks represent latency. And if it's green, it's low latency. If it's red, it's high latency. And the lightning bolts represent the actual speed. So if you have 3 lightning bolts, that means it's broadband speeds of 25 megabits per second. So Iridium, it's certainly better than the previous generation, but it still doesn't quite have broadband speed, but it does have low latency and it does support voice communications. There are several emerging Internet of Things, IoT, constellations, including a Canadian company called Kepler. They have 2 3-unit CubeSats already up and running for store and forward. It's very high latency. It is fast. If you actually have a Kepler satellite in view, you will get broadband speed. It's quite fast. But with only 2 up there, there's significant latency, maybe 40 minutes or longer between the 2 different satellites circling in polar orbit. However, eventually they're planning for a constellation of 140 satellites. At that point, perhaps they can get to a near real-time connectivity. Hyber out of the Netherlands has a similar proposal underway. They also have 2 satellites launched, and they plan to launch an additional 50. An Australian company called Fleet Space will be very focused on Internet of Things, IoT connectivity, and they have 4 satellites in polar orbits, and they will probably be expanding those in the future. So as we look at this, we see there is no real-time broadband speed coverage across the entire Arctic yet. However, as we think about some of these future mega constellation operators, things will be changing. Next slide, please. Starlink by SpaceX plans to launch over 4,000 LEO satellites. They will begin service this year, and they will focus with an initial fleet of 1,600 satellites. Telesat is also in the market with, or they will plan to begin service in 2022, and their focus is vertical markets. Both these constellations have cross-link architectures, which reduces the dependence on ground stations. OneWeb recently filed for bankruptcy last month. It is a shame because they have over 70 satellites currently in orbit, and their focus has been extreme latitudes. This is going to be a very interesting time because they have some satellites up and running, and it will be interesting to see who might buy these satellites. Amazon Kuiper is focused on mid-latitudes. Perhaps they would be interested in acquiring the OneWeb satellites at some point. So again, for the general consumer market, the 2 key players now that seem viable are SpaceX and Telesat. Next slide, please. So this slide is interesting. Across the x-axis, that represents the population of the planet. Most of the Earth's population is in the northern hemisphere. OneWeb, Telesat, and SpaceX occupy different latitudes. It's interesting to see how OneWeb's constellation really focused on these extreme latitudes. That's the blue line here. And Telesat is focused kind of across several latitudes. And SpaceX, their initial focus is mid-latitudes. Now, Amazon Kuiper is not on here, but their focus is primarily mid-latitudes as well. So as you think about these OneWeb satellites, think about who might want to acquire them in order to expand coverage to extreme latitudes. But again, these densely populated regions already have several options of connectivity, including fiber, including geos, et cetera. So the polar regions really represent an untapped market with relatively inelastic demand. Next slide, please. So I've addressed and discussed the low Earth orbit mega constellations, but it's very important to remember that GEOS and HEOS offer some very good options. For instance, Inmarsat and Space Norway are looking at a partnership for broadband connectivity for their Global Express customers. This could allow for a hosted payload on a HEOSat to provide continuous coverage above 65 degrees. Pacific Dataport is another interesting value proposition. Pacific Dataport's geosatellite is going to be optimally aligned longitudinally aligned with Alaska, and that will allow further northern reach up to 75 degrees. This could be a very interesting play. It'll allow high throughput capability at lower cost for broadband speed internet. They are scheduled to launch in late 2020. Next slide, please. So getting back to the geopolitics of the region itself, it's really the story of the three bears: Russia, China, and the Arctic Council. And I might add that Russia is already a member of the Arctic Council, but it is also the largest Arctic nation by landmass, population, and military presence above the Arctic Circle. Russia generates between 20 to 30% of its GNP above the Arctic Circle. It's a huge Arctic player, and by contrast, the US only generates 1% of our GNP above the Arctic Circle. So they have a huge stake in this region. They've been working very closely with China on various fronts. China has declared itself a near Arctic state. Now, that term has really kind of irritated a lot of folks who are actual Arctic permanent members, the 8 members, because there is no real definition to what that means. Secretary Pompeo asked, do we want the Arctic Ocean to transform into the new South China Sea, fraught with militarization and competing territorial claims? And I think this statement came about because China is really beginning to throw its weight around quite a bit. Recently, there was a moratorium in 2018 on banning fishing in the Arctic Ocean, and many countries signed up to that, including China. So there is this feeling of cooperation and a rule-based order. Next slide, please.
Karen, before you move on, I have a question for you. China is mentioned quite a lot. What about other non-Arctic countries? Who else is beginning to assert themselves into the geopolitics and commercialization of the region?
Well, those would be the other observer states. It includes quite a few of the European countries, including France, Germany, Italy, Spain, England, the Netherlands, Poland, India. It also includes various non-governmental organizations or NGOs, such as the Arctic Institute of North America, and even the Association of World Reindeer Herders.
Interesting. Thank you.
Okay, next slide, please. So Russia is very much capitalizing on climate change. You can see the middle picture here. This is actually what's called a liquefied natural gas vessel, LNG. And it's a huge play for Russia. I used to be in the oil business, and we'd run economics on gas plays. And when we'd look at world forecasts, and this was years ago, we would discount Russia, saying, they'll never get their gas out of Siberia. Well, they are. And they are producing a huge amount of reserves in Siberia. And they're using these LNG tankers and the Northern Sea Route to bring gas, LNG gas, to market. This has increased, as I mentioned earlier, the maritime traffic 7-fold in just the last 3 years alone. So this is a very, very important development. Also, over time, and as the sea ice continues to melt, we will probably see more activity in the region, and it will certainly reduce the amount of time and mileage. I think Lina will speak a little bit more to the military investments by Russians in the area, but there's a significant investment in maritime infrastructure by the Russians, and the China Investment Fund, Silk Road Fund, is a partner in many of these infrastructure investments in the region. Okay. I think at this point, Lina will take over.
All right. Hello. Thank you, Karen. I'm Lina Cashin. I'm working out of Omaha, Nebraska. And good day to you all. Thank you for joining us on our Arctic webinar. The Arctic is indeed different. The history is interesting and the policies are evolving. If you could put up my first slide, please. I broke this down into 3 areas: the Cold War, post-Cold War, and the current era that I'm describing as competition. So let's go back to the Cold War era. Following World War II, NATO was established in 1949 for collective defense against the Soviet Union. 4 Arctic countries are members of NATO: US, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. The Cold War was a time of great uncertainty. The uncertainty was not knowing whether the Soviets were going to invade by air, land, or sea. The Soviets could use bombers, missiles, or submarines. The certainty was the most direct route from the Soviet Union to the United States was over the Arctic. Thus, the Arctic became very important. To limit damage from a Soviet attack, the US had to generate bombers in time to reciprocate. The US needed to have enough warning. So the United States collaborated with Canada to build a line of warning radars to detect incoming bombers or sea-launched invasions. If you take a look at the map on the right, the first line was called the Pine Tree Line, which ran from Newfoundland to Vancouver Island, just north of the US-Canadian border. However, there were concerns that the Pine Tree Line might not provide ample warning to launch a counterattack. So they built a mid-Canada line further north at the 55th parallel. But again, the radar wasn't able to characterize well. Sometimes the radar got overwhelmed by detecting flocks of birds. The US and Canada then developed the DEW line, which stands for the Distant Early Warning Line. They used the more capable radars there that could detect and track both from a location far north to provide more time for warning and time to respond to an attack. However, the radars were not able to detect incoming missiles or submarines. So the US made improvements and added the ballistic missile early warning system to detect missiles and submarine detecting cables to detect submarines. Currently, the US and Canada have the North Warning System. The warning system consists of 11 long-range radars and 36 short-range radars that work together in a system 3,000 miles long over the continent, across the continent. It was put in place and operated and maintained by the North American Aerospace Defense. It was put in place in the 1980s and replaced the DEW line, or the Distant early warning line that was built in the 1950s. The post-Cold War came to an end and global relations started warming. And that brings us to fast forward to 1991, when the Soviet Union was dissolved. Post-Cold War era is known as a time of cooperation in policymaking. The Bush and Obama administrations produced and released Arctic policies that focused on the benefits of cooperation. They discussed and displayed an era of cooperation with search and rescue, resource management, and environmental protection. This was the time of the rise of the Arctic exceptionalism. The Arctic was known as not a zero-sum game. Policies from 2009 to 2016 all promoted an era of cooperation. The next era is an era of increased warming and activity and tensions. The area, due to the temperatures warming, diminished ice coverage, declining snow cover, and melting ice sheets, there are new shipping lanes opening, which increases maritime activity from both the military and commercial ventures. In addition, thawing permafrost and storm surges have adversely impacted infrastructure and increased erosion on the seacoast. Also, the changing environment sometimes causes local populations to adapt by relocating. There are also ongoing sea disputes with Russia and Canada. Russia and Canada claimed the rights to regulate Arctic sea waters. Russia requires foreign vessels to obtain permission and pay for icebreakers escort in the Northern Sea Route. And Canada claims waters of the Northwest Passage to be internal waters, sovereign to Canada. China is also investing in the Arctic. China has icebreaking vessels and research stations and could potentially deploy submarines. In addition, China is attempting to alter the Arctic governance. As Karen pointed out earlier, despite having no territorial claims in the region, China links its economic strategy to the Arctic and has declared itself a near Arctic state. The United States does not recognize any such status. Because of the increased tensions, the DoD performed an Arctic assessment, which informs the DoD 2019 Arctic strategy. Next slide, please.
Lina, before you move on, I did have a question. So why is the Arctic different? We hear that there's an air of cooperation that doesn't exist elsewhere, but why is that? Or why do you think that is?
Well, the Arctic is different because the geopolitics of the Arctic, in the spirit of cooperation with the countries, they provide a really interesting perspective. And I think it's because it's such a remote area that people need to depend on each other. So to answer this, let me tell you a little story I found in my research. It's called the Whiskey War. There is an island called Hans Island between Greenland and Canada. And this little island is only about a half a mile wide, and it sits right in the middle of this strait called the Nares Strait, which is 22 miles wide. And so this strait has this island in it. But if you remember what Karen said, the sovereignty of a country goes out to 12 miles. So this island is right in the middle of Canada and Denmark, who owns Greenland. And so in 1984, a officer from the Danish government went out and placed a Danish flag on this island and put a bottle of brandy there. And the flag said, "Welcome to Denmark." And then a little bit later, the Canadian officer went out and placed a flag that said, "Welcome to Canada," and put some Canadian club there. And so now this is this ongoing thing where it's called the Whiskey War, because Denmark came in and replaced the flag and put schnapps on, and then Canada keeps putting Canadian Club there and welcoming people to their country. So it's just an example of how the relations in the Arctic, there might be disputes, but typically it's solved cooperatively in a very kind of amicable, diplomatic way. But the current era, not everyone, as I mentioned, in the competition current era, not everyone sees it that way. So what we have is a DoD Arctic strategy that was established in 2019, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Thanks for the question. So next slide, please. So the DoD Arctic strategy defines the ends, ways, and means the Department of Defense is to proceed in the Arctic. The ends describe what is wanted as an objective. That is to quickly identify threats in the Arctic, to shape this and identify the threats, respond properly, and shape the security environment. And the way they're going to do that is to build Arctic awareness, enhance Arctic operations, and strengthen a rules-based order in the Arctic. The means of accomplishing it is on the next slide, is through the joint forces. They're going to work with our Department of Defense and our Homeland Security, as well as our allies and partners. So the has 8 major military installations in Alaska and 1 in Thule, Greenland. The Army, the Air Force, and the Coast Guard run organizations and installations that range from 10,000 people all the way down to only a couple hundred people at these installations. They also provide training and equipping cold weather operations. So if you look at the middle picture there, you see some Army soldiers walking out. What they're doing is testing capabilities of their uniforms and also of materials. As you know, when a battery gets cold, it drains very quickly. So in the Arctic, batteries have a very problem with performance. So the Army has engineering sites and testing to work on different equipment for the joint force. The Navy is also a big player in the Arctic, as you might expect. The middle little emblem there that says ICEX is a Navy submarine exercise that they accomplish. It's a very large exercise with 35 organizations and 4 interagencies that participate, as well as the United States, United Kingdom, and Norway all work together to test their techniques and procedures for interoperability in the Arctic. And then finally, a lot of the capabilities for the Joint Force are uniquely established to help prosecute any kind of contingencies or work them from the Arctic. And if you look on the bottom right, that's an LC-130. If you look closely, you'll see it's outfitted with skis. They have a fleet of 10 LC-130s that are launched out of the New York Air National Guard to support Arctic operations. But out of all of these installations in Alaska and Thule, that's not the only military installations in the Arctic. Next slide, please. Russia has the largest landmass in the Arctic. If you look at the pink, that's all Russia's landmass. They have 18 military installations that are indicated on this map. And what they're doing in the Arctic is refurbishing old airfields, providing new military bases along the Arctic coastline. And they're working on a concerted effort to establish a network of air defense and coastal missile systems, early warning radars, rescue centers, and a variety of other sensors. So Russia has a very large presence in the Arctic. There's also other countries, as you see. Karen pointed out Svalbard, that's there with the Yellow Star, which is the world's largest satellite tracking ground station. And then you'll also see Thule, Greenland up in the top. And then on the far right is Alaska with the different installations from the US military on that. Next slide, please. So in addition to the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security from the United States also has a very persistent military presence. The Coast Guard is the leader in this area. They maintain the U.S. national security. They lead by example by patrolling the international waters using a dual space approach. And they also engage with community and federal and international partners to advance American security and prosperity in the region. The important key for the Coast Guard to work well in the Arctic is they need ice cutters. These security cutters is something that they're advocating for additional support. And as noted there, they require continued commitment and solid investment, including acquisition of polar security cutters. Another area that Homeland Security is providing in the Arctic is the Arctic Domain Awareness Center. That is the Science and Technology Center of Excellence that is situated at the University of Alaska in Anchorage. There they study marine robotics, biology as it pertains to the marine environment, satellite support, civil engineering, and big data analytics. At ADEC, they also do social science to include gaining insights from Alaska Native communities. So the missions of the Department of Defense and Homeland Security are underpinned and really supported by the Space Force. Next slide, please.
Lina, before you move on, I have a question for you. What critical capabilities are urgently needed in the Arctic to maintain security and stability?
So if you go back to the last slide where I was talking about the Coast Guard, one of the big concerns the Coast Guard has is in order to protect the America's interests in the Arctic, they need 6 polar security icebreakers. 3 of them heavy is what they've said. And they only have 2 right now, the Polar Star and the Healy. One is a heavy icebreaker and one is a medium-sized icebreaker. So they are asking for additional funding from the Department of Defense and Homeland Security to get money for those ice cutters. Thank you for the question. Okay, and so the Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security relies on the Space Force and what capabilities bring to bear for the joint forces. If you look at the top of the slide, I've outlined Clear Air Force Station in Alaska and Thule Air Base, Greenland. The missions will soon transfer to the Space Force. We don't know if the bases will actually transfer to the Space Force. That's to be decided. But the missions of supporting space surveillance and satellite control network are very important, and they underpin the capabilities of the Space Force. What they do in Clear and Thule is track thousands of objects each day and also provide satellite command and control to Department of Defense satellites. The key to supporting national security interests in the Arctic is no different than joint force requirements. All of our joint forces and Department of Homeland Security rely on satellite communications, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, missile warning, environmental monitoring, and position navigation and timing. The key is the Arctic doesn't already have infrastructure to provide these things in a terrestrial way. So this is where space assets can really support the Arctic in closing the infrastructure gap. Combining military, allied, civil, and commercial assets can all support a safe and secure and stable Arctic domain. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, the new Arctic requires a unique way of thinking. The Arctic has enjoyed peace and relative in relative obscurity for many years, but things are different now. The competition of the great powers has increased commercial and military activity and brought the Arctic to the forefront. Our US government policies underpin a rules-based international order to maintain security and stability in the region. Working through the Arctic Council, as Karen mentioned earlier, the US can work with other Arctic nations and indigenous people to ensure long-term security to meet civil, environmental, and economic goals. So the time is now to respond to increasing demands. And we need to work together with the commercial sector to close the digital divide, enhance operations, and build situational awareness in the Arctic. So thank you for your time. We appreciate you listening, and we welcome your questions.
Great. Thank you, ladies, so much. We're so appreciative to have you here today. I do have a question for you, Karen. So oil prices are at a 17-year low, and Alaska depends upon oil royalties to fund its budget since there's no state income tax or property tax. Given the extremely low price on oil, could Alaska fall off a financial cliff, and how would this impact their strength and our strength as an Arctic nation?
I think this is a very important issue. In Alaska, it's very unique. No sales tax, no income tax, and no property tax. So Alaska's budget, state budget, relies totally on their mineral wealth. And at an all-time low, could be the new normal maybe. And I do think we need to take a look at this, because a strong Alaska means that the U.S. has a strong Arctic posture. And so we need to look at what can we do as a nation to ensure that the state of Alaska is whole. Maybe the state of Alaska needs to look at some of their tax policies as well, but I do think this is a concern. Where are some opportunities, whether it's through grants, infrastructure grants, or so on, where we can begin to improve the security of the region?
Great, thank you. And I know Karen and Lina, you both have special guests in your background. It's the polar bear. I saw Lina, you're just waving. And what are their names? Lina, what's the name of yours?
This is Ursa Major.
And Karen, what's yours?
This is the little sister, Ursa Minor.
Oh, how cute. Well, we're also glad to have them here today. On a more serious note, Lina, I have one question for you. What are some creative options to leverage space capabilities in an efficient way?
Oh, thanks for that question. I think Karen really covered quite a bit of the space opportunities that we have in position navigation and timing for new innovative ideas, but also she primarily focused on the communication aspect. I think for us, the big opportunity is to take US government space assets and leverage commercial assets, whether those are hosted payloads or working with allies as well, to collaborate with those different companies that are really on the outer edge of technology innovation, and collaborating with commercial and allies. I think we can really do a lot of good for the Joint Force, for Alaska, and for indigenous people up in the Arctic.
Great. And then I would ask each of you, starting with Karen, what would be the key takeaway you want people who are watching this talk to think about going forward?
I think one key takeaway is a sense of optimism. I think we're showing that there are ways to cooperate, and successful ways to cooperate, like the 16-year fishing moratorium, for instance. You compare this region to other areas of the world where there's ecosystem collapses going on. The South China Sea, for instance, between 75 to 95% of the fish stock is just gone. So we have an opportunity here in the Arctic through the Arctic Council to cooperate in this friendly way, to work with some of these other countries.
I think that's terrific, Karen. I would say also is that it needs to be a rules-based governance. And we need to make sure that as countries are working in different contracts and treaties, that there is a way to validate and ensure that these are being followed. And that makes the Arctic a more safe and secure environment.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. We really appreciate having you. Do you have any final thoughts or anything else that you'd like to share?
Well, I'd just like to say stay tuned for some upcoming papers on the Arctic. We're going to continue to study this region and look at the space infrastructure implications as well.
Great.
And I would just like to point out this Rutledge book on the Arctic is especially helpful if anyone is interested in researching the Arctic. This was just published in 2020 and has been really the source of a lot of our information.
Lina, we shift it just a little so we can see the cover there. A little bit more, like put it right in front of your face. I know that's pretty awkward, but thank you. We'll also share the title of the book in the show notes, so don't worry about that. Oh, it's a nice cover too. I really like that. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. Our next episode is going to be Whither Human Spaceflight with John Logston and Jim Vetta. As usual, you can find us at aerospace.org/policy. Be sure check out past episodes, sign up for the latest events and news, and stay up to date with us and keep following us. And again, we really appreciate your patience. We know this can be really unpredictable with the internet right now and so many people being on, but the best way is to sign up for our alerts. And if you register, please be sure to opt in for updates. That way you'll know, because we do send out the video if we end up recording and for whatever reason we're not able to go live. So thanks again, everyone. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.